presidential contest in Singapore on the cards for the first time in more than a decade. Now, a three-cornered fight brewing as hopefuls vie for the country's highest office, I'm Glenda Chong. Good morning, and I'm Chan Yu Im. Welcome to CNA's Nomination Day special for Singapore's presidential election. Within the next few hours, we will find out just whose names may be on the ballot papers on the 1st of September. Three people, they're qualified to run as candidates for the presidential poll. They are former GIC Chief Investment Officer Ng Kok Song, former NTUC Income Chief Tan Kin Lian, and former Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam. The Presidential Elections Committee rejected three others, including entrepreneur George Goh, for failing to meet eligibility requirements. Now, the president has no executive authority and is not involved in the day-to-day running of the government. Still, analysts say it's a position that helps to maintain integrity in the system, and this includes being able to veto government budgets and key public appointments if there are reasons to do so. And today, all eyes will be on one building in the Jalan Besar area. That's the People's Association headquarters, where the nomination process will take place from 11 a.m. onwards. The prospective candidates are set to arrive within this hour, and we will be bringing you the latest developments through our cameras and reporters. Tan Hui, Lauren Ong and Geraldine Yap are our eyes and ears, and they are on the ground.
I'm Tan Hui and I'm inside the nomination centre, and we'll be expecting the three presidential hopefuls, Tan Kin Lian, Tharman Shanmugaratnam and Ng Kok Song, to come into the nomination centre, and we'll tell you if their nomination papers were filed successfully or if any objections were raised.
I'm Lauren from inside the nomination centre as well, where I'll be keeping an eye on the room where the presidential hopefuls will be delivering their documents. Lots of movements in the following hours. We'll be giving you the updates as the clock ticks down.
I'm Geraldine Yap reporting from outside the nomination centre. Now, here is where supporters of the three presidential hopefuls will gather as they wait for news on who's been successfully nominated and hear from the candidates after nomination proceedings close. And I'll be bringing you the latest action.
And back in our studio, we will be analysing the day's developments with Associate Professor Eugene Tan from Singapore Management University. Well, there are some key timings we'll be marking over the next few hours. 11 a.m. is the first milestone, and that's when the nomination window opens. Qualified candidates will need to file their papers within the hour. Noon is the cutoff. At this point, if there's only one candidate nominated, the returning officer will declare that person elected to the office of president. If there is more than one nomination, we'll have to wait half an hour more for the announcement of a contested election. And that's because the hopefuls' teams and the returning officer himself, now they have up to 12:30 p.m. to raise any objections. It could be for a variety of reasons, such as missing documentation or incorrect particulars. If no objections are filed, the returning officer will announce a contest, paving the way for polls on the 1st of September. The floor will then be passed to the candidates, and they'll each be allowed to make a short speech with a strict time limit of 2 minutes, after which the campaign period commences. Well, let's cross over to our reporters Geraldine Yap and Tan Hui at the nomination centre. Jerry, are we seeing supporters now trickling into the nomination centre?
Well, the doors at the nomination centre have just opened to the public at 10 a.m. And I haven't seen any supporters come in yet, but, you know, as early as 9:30, we already saw some supporters queuing up outside the PAHQ. You know, a lot of them were dressed in maroon shirts, and these, I believe, are supporters of one of the presidential hopefuls, former Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam. You know, so they all came in matching shirts, you know, printed with the name and slogan as well. So there's actually not much activity happening at the supporters area as of now, but we're expecting things to pick up over the next a couple of hours. But for these early birds who are already beginning to make their way into the supporters zone, it's going to be quite the wait for them because we're only expecting to see the candidates and to hear from them at the earliest 12:30 p.m. and that's where the successfully nominated candidates will come out and make their speeches to the supporters and then thereafter come out and greet the supporters.
So Jerry, plenty of activity expected, but there are also rules in place as well. Tell us about those.
Of course. So one of the rules that are in place is that, the supporters are allowed to bring in things like banners, placards and flags, but they're not allowed to display any of these things until the nomination proceedings close, and they can only take these banners and flags out during the speeches of each of the candidates. And they're also not allowed to shout any slogans or go around to make speeches in any parts of the nomination centre. And as I mentioned earlier, the candidates will be allowed to come down and to greet their supporters after all the speeches have been delivered. And of course, there will also be rules inside the nomination centre that the candidates will have to adhere to. And my colleague Si Hui will tell you more about that.
Now, in about an hour, we will be expecting the hopefuls to come through the nomination centre, but the first to arrive is already here. He's Ng Kok Song. He came by the entrance over there. Now, there's a media scrum right here. Around 50 to 100 of us are right here. He came through the entrance with his proposer, his seconder, his assenters, and he went into that auditorium over there. Now, we don't have access into the auditorium, but what we know is that he's filing his nomination papers. He also has to submit his certificate of eligibility, political donation certificate, as well as his community declaration certificate. Now, they also have to submit a deposit of $40,500, and this will be lost if they eventually get a vote of less than 12.5% during polling day. But all eyes will be on this notice board. Now, the forms will be placed here. All three notice boards will have the nomination papers, and their team will have to scrutinize the details. And this includes the NRIC numbers, the names, the occupations of the entire team. And if they see anything missing or anything wrong, they have to make amendments by 12 noon. And they could also raise objections. The opposing parties could raise objections, but really this is only approved by the returning officer, Tan Meng Dui.
Si Hui, our social media team has alerted us to a Facebook Live and online posts made by Tan Kin Lian just an hour ago. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, there's already drama early in the wee hours of the morning. Tan Kin Lian went live on Facebook. He accused the mainstream media that he is a victim of a smear campaign because of his previous posts on so-called pretty girls. Now, this all came about when Aware, it's a women's organization, they say that it is objectifying women, and they are saying that the PEC is giving a certificate of eligibility to someone which they say is good in integrity and character, but they say that how can this be? Because he seems to be objectifying women. And so Tan Kin Lian hit back and said that he is a victim of a smear campaign. But the PEC says that the fact that they've given a certificate of eligibility, it does not mean that they endorse him for his so-called pretty girls posts, and say that they cannot revisit the certificate of eligibility because it's already issued. So a lot of drama already early in the morning, and anticipation right here in the nomination centre with all the journalists, including myself, right here.
All right, thank you very much, Si Hui, Tan Si Hui at the nomination centre. Let's turn to our guest now, Associate Professor Eugene Tan. So what do you make of those comments made by Mr. Tan Kin Lian?
Yurim, I think it's certainly a very strong reaction. And I think his whole campaign is very much at stake. And so in a way, if you think about it, his response is perhaps unsurprising. I think even before the official campaigning has begun, I think he has to deal with this significant issue, right? And I think looking at the Facebook post and the Facebook Live, he's certainly coming out all guns blazing. But it's a dangerous tactic, right? Because it could backfire, right? Digging in could again, deepen people's concerns, about whether someone who put those sort of posts online, whether that reflects concerns, that voters should be mindful of.
And should we be mindful of these? As you say, voters should be mindful of it. So how will this then affect a voter's decision, do you think?
Well, I think in the end, it very much boils down to what they make of those posts, right? So they will hear, Mr. Tan's response, that it's malice, it's a smear campaign. But people will then look at the posts themselves and decide, where they think the truth lies. So I would say that his campaign is in a way now on the defensive, and this is even before the gun has been fired.
All right, Eugene, stay with us. One moment, we'll go to some sound bites from the candidates. Now, independent candidate or non-establishment and no party affiliations. As you know, these are credentials that some presidential hopefuls were quick to point out when they threw their hat in the ring. And among them, former GIC investment chief Ng Kok Song says he's what he calls an independent hopeful. He told media he's in the running because he felt Singaporeans did not want a walkover.
We must make a distinction between establishment and government or the ruling party. I have never been a member of any political party. I have never been a member of the People's Action Party. But it's inevitable that when you serve in public service at a high level, you interact with ministers, with permanent secretaries. So yes, I have been a member of the establishment, but I have never been a member of any political party.
Mr. Ng says that this lack of ties to any party qualifies him for the role of president, stressing he's what he calls a non-government endorsed candidate.
I feel that as a politically neutral person who can rise above politics, I will be in a better position to help unify our country so that our differences of views, our differences of political affiliation do not become divisions in our society and tear our society apart.
Well, not to be outdone, fellow hopeful, former NTUC Income chief Tan Kin Lian said he's confident of being the only non-establishment candidate. And this happened when he launched his bid in early August.
I know that the people of Singapore want to have a contest and they want to have a chance to vote for someone who is independent of the ruling government.
Mr. Tan had also challenged another hopeful businessman, George Goh, to talk it out in hopes of splitting the so-called non-establishment vote. And this sparked a to and fro spat between the two men for many days.
It's very important that the independent candidates, and I think Mr. George Goh is independent, should not split the vote of the people who want an independent person as president. So I will certainly try my best to convince him. And of course, how shall we decide? I think the best way is if we know what the people want. But of course, it's quite hard to know what the people prefer. So this one has to be decided. And one possible way is to take a coin and twist a coin.
Election is a very serious matter. It's not like the two individuals sit at a coffee shop and we talk about presidentials, who to come into. No, please stop that. I want to make it very clear. Focus your campaign. All right? Let the voter make the decision.
Mr. Goh was eventually ruled out of the running by the Presidential Elections Committee. One hopeful had also distanced himself from the establishment right from the start.
I'm not on the same team as the government once I become president, Be very clear about that. All I meant is that my cast of mind all along has been that I'm a cast of mind that likes being in defense. but I'm not in the same team as the government. Be very clear on that. If anything, I'll be a referee.
All right, let's come back to you, Professor Tan. Now, a lot has been said by the candidates. They each have a different approach to what it means to be independent from the establishment or having political ties. So what is your interpretation, as well as how each of them has positioned themselves?
I think there's something which, too much perhaps has been made out of it. But I want also to be clear. Independence is, of course, important, right? The president must be able to exercise his custodial powers in particular without fear or favor, particularly from the elected government of the day. But independence is not a means, for the president to have to be a separate alternative center of power. So we must bear in mind, right, that all candidates, or at least hopefuls until they are declared candidates, will have to resign from any political party if they are members of any. And the oath of office that they will subsequently take if one of them is elected requires them to act without fear or favor. And there are institutional safeguards in the Constitution as well, to ensure that the president cannot be pressured, by the government of the day, such as the president having a fixed term of 6 years. There are very difficult criteria under which a president may be removed from office. So in my view, I think, it is important not to be obsessed with independence, right? All the candidates will claim to be independent. But I think what is really more essential, right, is to really look at their track record, look at how, they have conducted their professional lives, look at their speeches, look at their campaign messaging, and then to really ask, whether, they are truly independent or not. I think we must not get away, thinking that independence, is something that, that the candidates use, as a means of pressuring the government. I think, we must remember that our form of government remains a parliamentary one, with the general direction of policy being made by the elected government of the day, and that elected government of the day is accountable to Parliament, for its actions and its decisions.
Right. Prof. Tan, you mentioned that, let's look at their track record. Well, if we look at their track record, some will say that Mr. Ng and Mr. Tharman are quite close to the establishment. If that is the situation, how do you see perhaps the votes being split? Because if they're close to the establishment, then how do you differentiate between the two if they both say that they're not part of the establishment?
Well, I think
you can't run away from the optics, though, I have to say.
No, you can't run away from the fact that, they all have this past affiliations, to varying degrees. But I think it is important to recognize that past affiliations are not determinative in my view, right? Because each of us have past affiliations. Does that mean that in future, if an action requires us to be independent, we are not able to be so? I think, so we shouldn't push that argument too far. But I think, ultimately, voters are going to look into, their backgrounds. They will have to determine, whether each candidate, will be sufficiently independent, right? And by that, I mean being able to exercise the powers of the president without fear or favor. And so I'm actually not too concerned about, the votes being split, between, Mr. Ng and Mr. Tharman, the idea that they are both, former members of the establishment. Because I think, ultimately voters are going to decide, who they think, is the best person. And the best person, is a mix of many different criteria, track record, measure of independence, the ability to get the job done, who can best represent Singapore on international stage. So I think, in the end, voters cannot fuss over, whether they're splitting their votes. I think in the end, they will decide, who is the best person for them. And in that sense, voters have the agency, have that autonomy.
You talked about criteria, and Mr. Ng seems to have positioned himself as being from the establishment, but not from any political party or the government. So to what extent might this work in his favor?
Well, I think Mr. Ng has been, very shrewd in that sense, right? So you have, Mr. Tharman, with his long association with the ruling party, and then you have at the other end, Mr. Tan Kin Lian, so he had previous affiliations with the ruling party, as well as the NTUC, the labor movement, which has symbiotic relationship, with the ruling party. And if you look at Mr. Tan, his team also has opposition politicians, supporting him and advising him. So Mr. Ng has occupies this niche position, if I can put it that way. That I'm not, I don't have any political party affiliation, but I was a member of the establishment, so I know how the government works. The government would have sufficient trust in me because, I was formerly the Chief Investment Officer of GIC, Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund. So I think we can see, Mr. Ng emphasizing this particular point, that he occupies this niche position, so if you don't want the extremes, well, there is this possibility, of me, being someone who can be independent, again, using the words that the candidates, the hopefuls have so far been trying to emphasize.
Well, let's look at Mr. Tharman then. He says he wants to be a president for a new era. He's repeatedly played up his independence of mind as his strength. So what is the main appeal here?
Well, I think here, we are looking at, Mr. Tharman, who is very realistic, that he cannot run away from his past affiliations. And I don't think he's making any attempt to run away because that past affiliation gave him that track record, right? So if you look at his track record, whether as education minister or as finance minister, there were many policies, which he had initiated, and if we look at how the government, as some observers have pointed out, have moved left of center, and I would trace back to many of his, significant budget speeches, where he spoke about, the need to strengthen social safety nets. So I think, it is crucial, that voters look at each candidate's track record, and past affiliation, to my mind, should not be determinative, right? Because if that's the case, then I think, we are missing out on other criteria, that would, and attributes, that would make a candidate successful as a president. So Mr. Tharman has, unsurprisingly, focused on that independence of mind, that although he was a member of the political party, the government, he has throughout his political career, focused on being independent in the sense that, he offers his views in cabinet without fear or favor. You see that reflected in policies that he put in place when he was finance minister or education minister. So I think, that's the tack that he's taking. And I think in the end, he will constantly remind voters to look at his track record.
All right, Prof. Tan, please stay with us because, plenty of buzz at the nomination center already as supporters. Now they're starting to stream in. And we head live to Geraldine Yap there. Jerry, tell us what's happening there right now.
Right, as you mentioned, there's plenty of buzz right behind me now. I can see at least 100, 200 supporters, mostly of Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. They've been streaming in over the last half an hour or so. Many of them have come in customized printed T-shirts, and many others are in matching maroon T-shirts as well. I spoke to some of the officials so far, and they told me that there is actually no designated area for supporters of each of the three presidential hopefuls. So, the supporters who are streaming in now, they're really just kind of sorting themselves out into areas. But as far as I can see, most of the people here, they are supporters of Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. And, there's quite a lot of buzz. They're excited, but they're also just patiently waiting for the proceedings, the things to take place. And it's going to be quite a wait for them, at least another 1 or 2 hours, because we know that the nominated candidates will only come out at 12:30 to make their speeches to the supporters. And so, from now to then, it's going to be quite a wait in the hot sun, but there's tentage, so it's quite a wait for them. But I think they're all excited for the day ahead.
Oh, Jerry, quite a crowd there. Everyone looks very prepared despite the hot weather. Did you manage to speak to any of the supporters? What did they say to you?
Well, so I didn't actually get to speak to the supporters, but I did observe some things. I noticed that some of the supporters actually came holding matching maroon umbrellas as well. So even that is color coordinated down to the smallest detail. The umbrellas that they came with, and right behind me now, I can hear the chatter from them. I can tell they're really getting quite excited for to find out what's going to happen in the next couple of hours.
All right, thanks for that. Jerry speaking to us there live from the Elections Department. And we will be heading there, as and when we realize that, things are happening. And if you are just joining us, plenty of action already happening this nomination day for Singapore's presidential election. Former GIC Chief Investment Officer Mr. Ng Kok Song was first to arrive at the nomination centre right on the dot at 10 a.m. this morning. Former NTUC Income Chief Mr. Tan Kin Lian arriving next with his entourage not too long after the hour as well.
Yeah, thank you.
So that means one more hopeful is expected, former Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam. And here's a brief roundup of the three prospective candidates and what they champion. So former Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam was the first to throw his hat into the ring, making clear his intent in June. He has more than 20 years of experience in politics. Mr. Tharman has said that he wants to serve as a president for a new and more challenging era. His campaign slogan is respect for all. Former GIC Chief Investment Officer Ng Kok Song was the next to put himself forward in July. And he is currently the Executive Chairman of Avanda Investment Management. Mr. Ng calls himself an independent figure. The 75-year-old's campaign slogan is United for Our Future. And then there's former NTUC Income Chief Tan Kin Lian, the 75-year-old formally announcing his bid barely a week and a half ago. Now, he wants to play an active role as president to improve the lives of Singaporeans. His campaign slogan is Bring Back Trust, Give Us Hope. And this is Mr. Tan's second presidential bid. If you remember, he came last among 4 candidates in the 2011 poll, losing his deposit as he did not secure enough votes. Let's check in on the latest at the nomination centre. Our reporter Lauren Ong joins us now live. So Lauren, activity there slowly but surely picking up. Tell us more.
Well, as you've heard, 2 presidential hopefuls have entered the nomination centre. They've actually walked through the corridor right behind me towards the glass door, towards the direction of the nomination place, which is where they will hand over the documents to the returning officer who oversees the election. Well, they would have to enter with their subscribers and make sure everything is in order. But to get a better sense of what the whole process is like, I had a chance to walk through the nomination process earlier, and let's have a closer look. From 10 a.m., the doors will open here at the People's Association. This driveway is where presidential hopefuls can enter the building. First, security checks, and then the Elections Department will check for 2 things. Firstly, a political donation certificate, and that they are accompanied by the subscribers. That is, a proposer, a seconder, and at least 4 assenters. Only then will they be able to proceed. They will want to finish these checks by 11 a.m. as that's when the process starts proper. In this room, which is the nomination place, is where presidential hopefuls deliver the documents to the returning officer who oversees the election. These documents include the nomination paper and the certificate of eligibility. They could be allowed to make corrections, but only before noon, as that's when nominations close. During this hour, accepted nomination papers will be put up on this notice board where other hopefuls and their subscribers can inspect them and raise objections if anything is not filled properly. The media can also view this board. Throughout this whole time, supporters will have gathered in this field right here, and from 12:30 p.m, all eyes will be on that stage waiting for the returning officer to come up and declare who has been successfully nominated. Then presidential candidates can give their speeches. Each will have 2 minutes to make their case to Singaporeans. Well, as they exit that stage that you've seen earlier, they will be given a chance to give a doorstop interview here before they greet the supporters. As the returning officer has successfully declared the successful candidates, they will also be issued documents which will include permits to display banners, flags in public spaces, as well as official stamps for these campaign paraphernalia. They will also be given a list of voters and their numbers. Back to you.
All right, Lauren, thank you very much. That was Lauren Ong at the Nomination Centre. Well, many factors at play in the contest to become president, from personalities to experience, charisma, and the right mix of social causes. For more, let's turn to our guest again, Professor Eugene Tan. Prof. Tan, we were talking earlier about Tharman, so I want to pick up on another issue here about him not being part of the establishment any longer. But he was involved in unlocking of the reserves twice, once in 2004 when he was finance minister, and then again recently the pandemic, although he wasn't directly involved, but he's been there in unlocking the reserves. Do you think that will actually help or hinder him this time around?
Glenda, I think when we look at the reserves, right, they are there for a purpose, right? So as we squirrel away, we're squirreling, our past reserves for a rainy day. And so when we look at the drawdowns, right, in the past, I think particularly most recently during the pandemic, these were essential, for extra fiscal resources, to be made available to the government, for example, to deal, with the pandemic. I think, it would be problematic, right, if you have a president who does not support where there is good justifiable reasons, to draw down past reserves, for the president not to support it. Now, the president cannot initiate any drawdown of past reserves, right? That prerogative lies with the elected government of the day. So a president a candidate, who might claim, that as president, I'm going to advocate the use of more reserves, I think that would be, overreaching, So I think it's important. I think if we look at the past drawdowns, I think most Singaporeans, if not all, would have no difficulty, with the fact that the reserves, ought to be used, when they need it to be used.
Okay, we're looking now at live pictures there. We've just seen Mr. Tharman arriving at the People's Association headquarters. Once again, you're looking at live pictures now.
Yes, earlier, former GIC Chief Investment Officer Mr. Ng Kok Song was the first one to arrive, and then after that, former NTUC Income Chief Mr. Tan Kin Lian quickly after. Now, Eugene, back to the discussion. Let's talk about the candidates championing the issues that are very close to their hearts. Mr. Tan Kin Lian, it seems, wants to champion public policies and municipal issues. To what extent can a president influence these things, if at all?
I think this is where, we'll see the candidates on the campaign trail, talking about how they could, influence the government. So it is an established fact, that the president, and the prime minister, as heads of the prime minister as head of government, the president as head of state with custodial powers, have to work together, right? That there will be issues, in which the president's consent or concurrence, will be needed. And so it is important that a healthy relationship, working relationship, is established. And so what we see, the candidates going on the campaign trail, really they're talking about, what they might do, in their roles beyond the custodial and ceremonial functions, right? So the president also has community functions, so that means supporting particular causes, that in their mind, could do with more recognition. So I would say that, in the end, it is important, to appreciate, that these are the different roles that the president play. And the question of trying to influence, again, is something which I think, it is important to recognize what the powers of the president are, right? So if the president has no prerogative, no function, let's say in initiating a drawdown of reserves, I'm not sure, the president can influence. But I think it's also important to recognize, right, a president that is able to command the trust and confidence of the elected government of the day, right, in particular the Prime Minister, will be in a better position, right, to engage in meaningful conversations, with the government on a regular basis, and in that sense, help to get the government to think about issues that it may not have considered on a particular topic, to consider perspectives, that the government may have missed out. So I think it's important to recognize what the powers are, and also to recognize, whether a president, would have the ability, to influence the government in a meaningful way.
Were you saying that in their private capacity, if they have a good relationship with the government? Well, let's look at it this way. There are no political parties, so technically no policies to debate. Would you say then, how would people vote? Is it really based on a candidate's personality, background, or values? How should we, when we go to the polls, if there's going to be one, how should we vote then?
Well, Glenda, we all have our own criteria, right? You can never run away from that. But what is important, particularly in a presidential election, is for voters to recognize, the powers and the role of the president, right? So we have to vote, for a candidate, who claims to want to exercise certain powers, but we must be sure that that particular office and those powers actually exist.
Prof, I'm just going to stop you there. We're looking at live pictures now of Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, and he has, we know, arrived at the People's Association headquarters there. And, well, I suspect very soon we might be able to see, some activities regarding those nomination papers, because that's what they're here to do today.
And yes, as we mentioned earlier on this morning, the other two candidates also arrived already, Mr. Ng Kok Song and Mr. Tan Kin Lian.
So we come back to, the sort of criteria that voters might use. I think for me, it is important to underscore the importance of recognizing the role and the powers of the president, right? So we can't be voting for an office that doesn't exist, right? So if a candidate is seeking, to initiate policies, the question is whether that candidate would be better off contesting in the parliamentary general elections rather than the presidential election. But we cannot deny the fact that, voters will look at, who they can trust, who they have confidence in, who they think, will be a good representative for Singapore on the international stage. As a small country, it is very important for us to be able to project our voice, as a voice of reason, as a voice, for small states, right? Small states are vulnerable, right? And even we must recognize that. So it's important for a president, who is Singapore's chief diplomat, to be able to engage with foreign leaders. While he doesn't set foreign policy, the president can certainly project Singapore's voice. And there will also be questions of, how independent is a candidate, for some voters. And voters will also, some voters will also look at the track records of each candidate. So there are these variety of factors, but ultimately, right, I think it boils down to the question of trust, right? Who a voter trusts to be able to get the job done as president without fear or favor, right? And to enable, government to function effectively and honestly.
Eugene, would you say that their partners might play a role in getting them to stand out, or could this be a bit risky?
One of the things that always has struck me, about presidential election, is that the spouses do feature rather prominently, right? So if you think about, when hopefuls go to the elections department to collect, the application forms, you often have, their spouses along with them. So I think it's important, that it is the candidate who's on the ballot sheet, right? Their spouses are not on the ballot sheet. But I think what they're trying to project, is that they have the support of their family. I think we're also mindful about how, the portrait of the president and the spouse of the president, will be on government buildings. There's also the issue when the president travels abroad, on state visits, he is often accompanied, by his spouse. Or in the current case, right, of Madam Halima, Madam Halima is accompanied by her spouse. So I think in the end, it's something which candidates, have come to take it as par for the course, that the spouses be actively involved. But I think the focus has to always be on the candidate, because we are going to vote, for the candidates and not their spouses.
All right. Well, Prof. I'm just going to leave it there for the time being, because, let's look at this. So what to do with the reserves has also been a rather hot topic. We know that. Mr. Tan Kin Lian, now he said that he would like a rethink of the current policy governing the spending of reserves.
Are we saving too much at the expense of the current generation so that we have more money for the future? The current generation already said, cost is too high, we can't afford this. I will certainly bring this up to discuss with the government.
Meanwhile, Mr. Ng Kok Song says the president must have what he calls domain expertise in handling the reserves. The former GIC chief investment officer says he has 45 years of experience doing just that.
If we are not careful, the reserves will be spent in no time. If we have a bad government, and if there's no president to check the government. So I have a very deep personal interest, having spent my whole professional career looking after the reserves. So I want to do whatever I can to protect the reserves.
Okay, Eugene, picking up on what Mr. Ng said there, he wants to protect the reserves. So if you go back to the genesis of the elected presidency, it's essentially about the president being able to act as a check on a rogue government. And former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew put it something like to prevent someone from raiding the larder that's wide open. So having the right expertise and experience here is quite significant, isn't it?
Oh, definitely, right? I think we are looking at, the use of past reserves, right, as an important custodial power of the president, right? The other being to safeguard the integrity of the public service with regard to key appointments. And the reserves really are what would enable Singapore to deal with very challenging situations, right? We have just come out of the pandemic. That was an existential challenge, and the ability, to get supply, to buy the goods and supplies that we need to get the vaccines. I think all that had to do with the fact that, our past reserves were used, that enabled us to manage, the pandemic relatively well. And of course, given the significant amount of reserves that we have, and of course that's a government secret, but I think, it is important that we do have significant reserves. And so there is a question of whether, as Mr. Tam pointed out, are we saving too much, right? So I think he's essentially saying that, are we saving such that the current generation is being deprived of, the benefits of Singapore's success and prosperity? But we heard from the clip, Mr. Ng has a different perspective, right? That if we are spendthrift, then there's a possibility that our reserves could be used in double quick time, because the temptation is always there for any government of the day to use the reserves, right? To provide for free healthcare, free education, everything that is free. But reserves are very hard to build up, but very easy to spend. I think all of us have our own family and personal savings. We know what it is like, and expand that, to the country. I think, there is no doubt that, the president holds, what has been called the figurative second key, right? So to unlock the reserves, right? The government holds one key, but you wouldn't be able to unlock the vault, that stores all our reserves, our gold bars and all, without the second key, right? So that's an important check. And it means, using the key when it is essential. And again, we must be mindful, right? The president cannot initiate the drawdown of past reserves. He can certainly have conversations with the government, right? But again, as I said, if the president doesn't command the trust and confidence of the government, I'm not sure he's going to be able to persuade. But ultimately, right, people are going to be concerned, if the government spends excessively and unjustifiably.
All right, thanks, Prof. Tan. We're going to be, speaking lots more on this, but we're heading for a short break, so don't go anywhere as we stay peeled to find out who will be contesting the Singapore presidency. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, plenty of action already happening this nomination day for Singapore's presidential election. All the presidential hopefuls have arrived at the nomination centre.
That is right. Mr. Ng Kok Song was the first to arrive just before 10 a.m. He walked into the nomination centre accompanied by his fiancée, Sybil Lau, just behind him.
Mr. Tan Kin Lian arrived around 10 a.m. just as the nomination centre opened for entry. He's accompanied by his family on this important day. It's his second go at the presidential bid, having been in a 4-horse race back in 2011.
Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam arrived at the People's Association headquarters around 10:30. Our reporters on the ground tell us he was welcomed with loud cheers and applause from his supporters. They came in coordinated colours, all dressed in maroon.
And he's accompanied by his wife, Janie Togi, and his team of subscribers. And they include the president of the Labour Movement, Mary Liu, and filmmaker Royston Tan.
We will, of course, be keeping a close eye on nomination proceedings here in Singapore. For now, the rest of the day's news with Shahida Othman.
Thanks, Yu Im. And we have some developments out of Thailand this hour. Former Premier Thaksin Shinawatra has returned to the kingdom after more than 15 years in exile. Local media reported that the private jet carrying Mr. Thaksin touched down at an airport in Bangkok. Now, he greeted supporters outside the private jet terminal with his daughter, Petongtan Shinawatra. He had originally planned to return on 10th of August, but delayed his flight for a medical checkup. The former leader faces prison sentences of 10 years in 3 cases in which he was convicted and sentenced in absentia. And Saksit Sayasumbat explains why the former Prime Minister's return is so significant.
For the past 20 years, ever since he became Prime Minister in the early 2000s, Thaksin Shinawatra had an impact on Thai politics for better or worse. And today is no different because, first of all, otherwise we wouldn't be still talking about him. And secondly, there wouldn't be such a big fuss here at Don Mueang International Airport at the private jet terminal. What can we expect to happen to him? Well, I mean, he has been sentenced to 10 years in prison in total in 3 different cases in absentia, ranging from abuse of power to corruption. So the police are definitely going to welcome him, not necessarily with open arms, but with an arrest warrant. Will be greeted by the police, and then he will be immediately sent to a judge, and then will be detained in the prison. The question, of course, is that how long will he stay in prison? How long will he have to remain in there? Can he seek a royal pardon? Will this pardon be granted very quickly? These are all the questions that are surrounding his arrival. Obviously, he wouldn't make this return if there haven't been some assurances made to him, and of course that has an impact not only on himself, but also on the political scene here.
Mr. Thaksin's return coincides with the parliament vote for a new prime minister, which is due to take place shortly. Now, the Thaksin-backed Partai yesterday unveiled an 11-party coalition, which includes former military-linked rivals. The move has been heavily criticized by some of its supporters. They say Partai is backtracking on a pre-election pledge that they will not join hands with pro-military parties. The party has nominated property tycoon Seta Tavasin for the premiership. And earlier we spoke with Eric Martinez Kuhonta, Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University, to gain an insight into the likelihood of Mr. Seta gaining the premiership.
His chances look pretty good. He has a coalition of about 11 parties, 314 seats in the lower house, and you need to have both houses, Senate and the lower house, for a total vote of half of 750 seats. So that's 376 seats to 376 votes to become prime minister. So 314 in the lower house. So he needs about 62 seats from the Senate. The senators are appointed from the military, so they are very conservative. The fact that the coalition now, as it has been proposed in the past few days, includes among its members 2 parties linked to the military, this is a deal that has been made, means that it is likely that this coalition in the lower house will get the support in the Senate, and that is crucial for this new prime minister to go through from Partai. But a recent development just a few days ago is that the Prime Minister of Canada of Partai has now been accused of some ethical issues when he was a head of a major real estate firm. And of course, they've rejected those ethical charges from this very famous whistleblower. But that is now roiling the scene, and we'll see how this develops.
And a quick check on the Thai baht this hour. It is strengthening slightly to more than 35 to the greenback. That is as the country's parliament gets ready to vote for a new prime minister. Now, Cambodia's parliament has voted to confirm ruler Hun Sen's eldest son as prime minister. The development completes a dynastic handover of power after last month's election. Hun Sen's Cambodian People's Party won all but 5 of 125 seats in the lower house in recent elections. But the vote was widely criticized by the international community as the main opposition party was barred from running. Following the win, Mr. Hun Sen announced he is handing power to his eldest son, Hun Manet. The Cambodian king, who holds a largely symbolic role, convened parliament yesterday. Now, this paved the way for lawmakers to endorse Hun Manet as the country's new leader. The new government includes a number of Hun Manet's relatives and allies in top jobs. Mr. Hun Sen is expected to become president of the Senate next year and acting head of state when the king is overseas. Japan will start releasing treated radioactive water from the wrecked Fukushima nuclear power plant into the Pacific from Thursday. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida confirmed the planned release date this morning after a ministers' meeting in Tokyo. He said he will ask plant operator TEPCO to discharge water based on the plan approved by the Nuclear Regulation Authority. The water is set to be released into the ocean at a maximum rate of 500,000 litres per day. Japan insists the gradual release is safe, a view backed by the UN Atomic Agency. However, the discharge plan has faced strong opposition both locally and from regional neighbours, including China. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has called on North Korea to cease its satellite launch after it informed Tokyo of its plan for some time this week. And Mr. Kishida says he has instructed his government to work with the US, South Korea and other nations to urge its cancellation. The planned blast-off is likely to be a retry of a military satellite launch which failed in May. That space module was described by North Korean authorities as the country's first strategic reconnaissance satellite to be put into orbit. But it plunged into the sea minutes after launch. The South Korean Navy later recovered the equipment fragments for analysis and confirmed they had no military utility. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has long prioritized the development of a military spy satellite. He says it is a necessary counterbalance to the growing U.S. military presence in the region. Meanwhile, the country's state media, KCNA, has slammed the ongoing annual military drills between the U.S. and South Korea. It also warned that the recent trilateral agreements to deepen ties between the two countries and Japan could lead to what it calls a thermonuclear war. Parts of Southern California are bracing for more potentially life-threatening floods triggered by Storm Hilary. It was the first in 84 years to make landfall in the region, dumping record rain that damaged roads and power lines. Tens of thousands of people have lost access to electricity. Now, Hilary weakened to a tropical storm from a hurricane over the weekend before being downgraded to a post-tropical storm overnight. But authorities warn that they're not out of the woods yet. It's now moving through the western U.S., where flood watches are in effect until tomorrow morning. Residents in affected areas are still grappling with the impact of the unprecedented deluge. Dozens of schools were forced to close and thousands of flights delayed or cancelled, with millions urged to stay indoors. No major damage has been reported, although the storm uprooted trees and inundated desert towns. Several people were swept into swollen rivers, while others were trapped in their vehicles.
I grew up down here in Palm Springs. I've never seen it this bad.
I'm digging the truck right now because we got stuck. We were trying to come through here. Like, we seen the rest of the cars doing it, but so we joined along.
Forecasters are warning of another tropical storm, this time headed for Texas. It is expected to hit the southern part of the state's coast tomorrow and will be called Harold. It could dump up to 25 centimeters of rain in parts of the state and across Mexico. U.S. President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden are in Hawaii to inspect the damage 2 weeks after devastating wildfires killed at least 114 people. He has declared the aftermath devastating and vowed to rebuild the way the people of Maui want.
We're focused on what's next. That's rebuilding the long term, rebuilding for long term, and doing it together to help get us back on our feet, to rebuild the way we want to rebuild, by making sure your voices are heard, by respecting your traditions, by understanding the deep history and meaning of this sacred ground, and establishing your community, not to change its character, but reestablish it.
After an aerial view of the devastation, the Bidens toured the historic town of Lahaina, ground zero of the carnage. They also met victims of the wildfires and first responders. Officials warn the death toll could surge as 850 others remain missing. The White House has approved $8.2 million in assistance to nearly 2,500 households, including nearly $3 million in initial rental assistance. And that's all from me at the moment. Back to you in the studio, Glenda, UM.
Thank you very much, Shah. Now, it's just past 11 a.m. here in Singapore and kicking off the crucial one-hour nomination window for the presidential election. All the presidential hopefuls have arrived at the nomination centre.
The first one to arrive, Mr. Ng Kok Song, just before 10 a.m., he walked into the nomination centre, accompanied by his fiancée, Sybil Lau.
Mr. Tan Kin Lian arrived around 10 a.m. as well, just as the nomination centre opened for entry. He's accompanied by his family on this important day. It's his second go at the presidential bid, having been in a four-horse race back in 2011.
Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam arrived at the People's Association headquarters around 10:30. Our reporters on the ground tell us he was welcomed with loud cheers and applause from his supporters. They came in coordinated colours, all dressed in maroon.
He's accompanied by his wife, Janie Togi, and his team of subscribers. They include the president of the Labour Movement, Mary Liu, and filmmaker Royston Tan. Now, Tan Si-hui, Lauren Ong and Geraldine Yap are our eyes and ears at the nomination centre.
Let's go live first to Geraldine Yap. She is outside the main building where the supporters have gathered. So, Jerry, it's quite a hive of activity where you're at. Tell us more.
Well, so things have calmed down a little bit, but as you mentioned earlier, at around 10:30 a.m. when Mr. Tharman arrived at the nomination centre, as he walked in, he stopped to greet the supporters, and there were huge cheers and a loud applause from the supporters who were, very excited to see him. But things have calmed down a bit more. Now they're just kind of chattering behind me and, getting excited for what's to come later in the day after the nomination proceedings and when the nominated candidates will come out and make their speeches. And there's quite a huge number of Mr. Tharman supporters, all dressed in matching maroon shirts, and they've actually taken up about half of the shelter that's been built up, the tentage that's been built up for the supporters. As for the supporters of the other potential candidates, I understand that supporters of Mr. Ng Kok Song are making their way into the nomination centre. And I also understand that there are some supporters of Mr. Tan Kin Lian, and that includes his son and his family. I saw earlier that Mr. Tan's son and his kids were also waiting in the sheltered area. So, we are seeing a mix of the supporters of the three potential candidates, but majority of them are here for Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam.
And Tan Si-hui joins us now from inside the nomination building. Si-hui, so the presidential hopefuls have arrived. So what's next for them?
Yeah, all three men have arrived, and they're right now in the auditorium just to give you a sense of things and the flow of the process. Now, they're in the auditorium, they're filing their nomination papers, they have to submit certificates of eligibility, the political donation certificate, as well as their community declaration certificate. They also have to submit a deposit of $40,500. Now, it's 11 a.m. and things will start to heat up because the nomination window is open. We expect them to come out later. The nomination papers will also be filed behind me on the notice boards, and all parties will have to look at the details carefully. They have to look at NRIC numbers, names, as well as occupation. If any of these are missing, they have to file and raise an objection by 12 noon. They have to make amendments, and of course this will be only approved by the returning officer. Now, what we also need to look out for would be the symbols, because they have not been revealed to the public yet, and what we understand is Mr. Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. He is looking to get his symbol approved later. And then we also know that Mr. Tan Kin Lian has a symbol that he wants approved, which will represent multi-ethnic races here in Singapore. So these symbols are really to make the elections more inclusive. Following the scrutinizing of details, if all is good, the returning officer will announce whether there will be a contest on the 1st of September, following which the presidential hopefuls will be making their way out to make their speeches, and we will be waiting here as well to await their doorstep.
Lauren Ong joins us now live. Lauren, what are the hopefuls doing in the room right now?
I'm on the other side of the media holding area, and I'm actually right outside the nomination place. Those glass doors is where we have seen some of the presidential hopefuls enter, but the only one who has entered the grey doors, which is to the nomination place, is Mr. Tan Kin Lian and his subscribers. Now, the grey door over there is one of the only doors to the nomination place, and he would have to submit his papers to the returning officer who oversees the election. But over the past half an hour, I've seen a dozen individuals walking out of that glass door, including Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, as well as the latest is Mr. Ng Kok Song, who is coming right behind me right now, as well as other assenters who have walked in and out of these glass doors, just waiting to get into the grey door to the nomination place.
All right, Lauren, thank you very much. That was Lauren Ong at the nomination centre. Earlier, we also heard from Tan Si-hui and Geraldine Yap.
Well, we're now in a crucial period of nomination proceedings. The hopefuls have until 12, that's noon, to submit their papers to the returning officer. But what exactly does the documentation involve? So these are the necessary documents: the nomination paper, certificate of eligibility, the community certificate, and the political donation certificate. The main document is the so-called nomination paper, also known as Form P4. Now, it's meant to signify a person's intention to run for the office of president. Here's an illustration of what it looks like. So you'll see the name, NRIC number, and occupation. And at the top right, the symbol of the candidate to be used during his or her campaign. And in this instance, we know it's all his. So the rest of the form will include the details and signatures of the official backers for the candidate. There must be one proposer, one seconder, and at least 4 assenters. At the bottom of the form, there are some further declarations. Well, for one, that the candidate cannot be part of a political party and that he has read and understood the role of the president as stated in the Constitution. Once he signs the form, he agrees to not have falsely declared any information or face penalties. The same form will be signed also by a commissioner for oaths or justice of the peace. Now, once the nomination paper is up, candidates have until noon to check if there are any errors or if anything is missing. They have been told not to submit their documents too close to that cutoff, and that's so that there's enough time to make amendments if needed.
All right, let's speak to Associate Professor Eugene Tan. Eugene, let's look at the 3 candidates a bit more closely. We'll start with Mr. Tharman, who's been described as a formidable candidate. Some might say clearly in the establishment camp, he has a very long political track record. Many also say he is the one to beat given his credentials, but he must have some challenges. What are his main ones?
I think his biggest challenge would be to ensure that people who want him to be president will actually vote for him. I know that might sound a bit of a contradiction in terms, right? But there's always the view that, well, maybe we need to send a signal, that he doesn't have overwhelming support, and I mean, many years ago, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew would describe that as a sort of freak election result. So I think that's his biggest concern, right? Given that he's seen as a candidate to beat, given that he arguably has the most impressive CV, and so the question of whether, people might assume there's a foregone conclusion. And I think it's probably fair to say that it is not a foregone conclusion. And I think Mr. Tharman would perhaps would like to be the underdog instead, because I think that will galvanize, people to use their votes very judiciously. So I think that's the biggest challenge. I suppose a related challenge would be, the question of whether he would be able to be, what some Singaporeans might describe as the independent president, given his long ties, with the People's Action Party. But I think he has been quite conscious, not to dwell on it, but instead, trying to talk about how he's going to promote, topics like multiracialism, respect for everyone in Singapore. I think in many ways, trying to use that, to demonstrate, that he has, that independence of mind, that he has always been a man unto himself.
So, Prof. Chan, saying that, then who will Mr. Tharman appeal to? Who will he have a harder time winning over then?
I think the second question is probably perhaps easier to deal with, right? I think those who are convinced, that someone with former affiliations, to the ruling party, should not be president, I think he will probably have the toughest time, trying to persuade them. But I think in the end, in a presidential election, it becomes crucial for a candidate to have broad-based appeal, right? So it's not enough to just win the support of one particular voting segment, or I often describe them as a vote bank. You need to be able to tap on, the support from many different vote banks, right? Whether it's the seniors, whether it's young people, whether it's first-time voters, whether it's homemakers, women, and we could go on. But I think, people who look at the criteria, the attributes of the presidency, what are the powers of the president, I think this could be the group that Mr. Tharman could have a fairly significant appeal to.
And looking at Mr. Ng Kok Song, he has no real affiliation with any political party. We discussed this earlier. He acknowledges he was part of the establishment. How do you see him getting past this association? Who will he most appeal to?
I think he would probably appeal to those who want a president who does not have any political affiliations, right? So we discussed earlier about Mr. Ng occupying that niche position, right? Not having any political affiliation, but someone who knows the system because he was a member of the establishment through his many years, first at the Central Bank, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and then subsequently, with a GIC, Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund. I think he will appeal, to those who take the view that, well, it would be better for a president not to have such close affiliation, right? Even though they are past affiliation, to the government of the day. So I think that would be his strongest appeal. But so long as he can occupy, that niche position.
All right. Well, let's look at Mr. Tan Kin Lian. This is, his second time round. And how relevant and strong is his platform, because he's touting himself as an independent candidate. Remember, he too had affiliations with the PAP back then. I mean, he's saying that, he doesn't want to boast, but this could be his year.
Well, I think it remains to be seen, right? I think his campaign has been hobbled by first, a late declaration of his intention, and subsequently, the flip-flopping, whether he and Mr. George Goh, someone who was not successful in getting a certificate of eligibility, whether one of them should give up. And then, he's now mired in controversy, over his many social media posts over the years, putting very simply, about pretty girls. So I think, and of course his reputation precedes him, being the only candidate in a presidential election since 1993 to have ever lost the election deposit. So I think his biggest challenge, right, is to make his campaign relevant, right? Relevant in the sense that, that he does have something to contribute, that he does have the attributes, the qualities that Singapore look for in a president. So I think it remains to be seen, whether this year, is the year.
All right, thanks, Eugene. We'll pick up the conversation soon. For now, we will look a bit more closely at our presidential candidates.
Right. Our presidential hopeful, Mr. Ng Kok Song, says that he will give his very best as he seeks the honour of occupying the highest office in the land. The 75-year-old former GIC Chief Investment Officer says he would like to honour the generations before him who built the strong foundation for Singapore. Now, he penned those words after receiving his certificate of eligibility. Rebecca Mateo with more on that man.
The former Fullerton building was where Mr. Ng Kok Song's 45-year public sector career began in 1970. He was an investment analyst at the Finance Ministry before moving on a year later, managing the country's reserves at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. But most of his career was spent with GIC. He was there for 27 years, rising to become Chief Investment Officer of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Mr. Ng says his experience complements the role of the head of state if elected.
I've spent my entire career in public service, helping to build up our reserves and also helping to build up the GIC as the government's fund manager. So I feel that I'm in a good position to help safeguard the use of our reserves. In regard to upholding the standards of key office holders, I spent 45 years in public service. So I understand full well the responsibilities and the standards of personal conduct that are expected of us.
Since throwing his hat in the ring, Mr. Ng has been stressing the importance of an independent candidate who has never been part of any political party.
I think Singapore would be better off with an independent president who can rise above politics and therefore better placed to unify our people, regardless of their political affiliation, so that as a country, we are in a better position to face the difficult times ahead.
In 2015, 2 years after his retirement, Mr. Ng co-founded Avanda Investment Management, a global asset management company.
Our Tan Kin Lian is another potential contender for the presidency. The former NTUC Income chief believes his chances are quite good. The 75-year-old says there is widespread desire for a president who is independent of the government. He touts himself as the only candidate who fits the bill. Alif Amshah has more.
Tan Kin Lian has thrown his hat in the ring for the second time. His maiden bid for the presidency was in 2011. Back then, he finished last out of 4 candidates, getting 4.9% of more than 2.2 million votes cast. As a result, he lost his election deposit of 48,000 Singapore dollars.
This time round, I'm very confident that I will not lose my deposit. I even quite confident that I might be elected as the president because I represent the only independent candidate. And many people say that's the most important criteria.
Mr. Tan was a member of the ruling People's Action Party for 30 years. He left the PAP in 2008 and has never held public office. If elected, he says his first task is to build trust with the government by holding conversations with cabinet ministers.
I'm not there to disrupt what they are doing. I'm just trying to, I would like to help them to find better ways. So that would be that conversation. Now, I've got 3 goals. Reduce the cost of living, make housing affordable, and make jobs secure. I recognize that this is the duty of the government, not the president, to run the country. I recognize that. But I'm sure some of my experiences will be quite useful to the government, and I'll be quite happy to share my views with them.
These experiences are from heading NTUC Income Insurance for 30 years, eventually becoming its CEO. During that time, he says he grew the company's assets from 28 million Singapore dollars to 16 billion. He says he did so by keeping costs low and giving good returns, which he believes are the same principles as running a country.
Then there's Tharman Shanmugaratnam. The former senior minister is often known for being a political leader, having spent some 20 years with the ruling People's Action Party. In an interview with CNA, he candidly revealed a lighter side through sharing his passion and family. Tan Soo-hui finds out more.
Student activism played a big role in Mr. Tharman's early days studying in the UK. And it was also in the UK where he met his wife, Jane Itogi, another important milestone in his life.
We eventually got married. Very simple marriage. We first went to a Hindu temple for a very basic ceremony on the way to the registry of marriages, and my mother was with us. Then, of course, we were keen on children. So we did a bit of research and found that there was this tribe called the Yoruba tribe in Africa, which had lots of twins, incredible fertility, and they ate a lot of yam. So my wife being Teochew, we decided we're going to go to every restaurant that has orni. Didn't know whether it was the husband who needs to eat orni or the wife. So we both whacked. Lo and behold, we had 4 children in quick succession.
And the most rewarding part, serving residents for 22 years. If elected as president, he says he won't change his style or personality.
I will continue to be who I am. I intend to be on the ground supporting initiatives, supporting civil society. I intend to be personal in the way I go about my work.
Now, if you were elected as president, what would be your process if you disagreed with the government of the day?
If it's the constitutional role of the president to exercise judgment and make a decision, that's of course something that I'll do scrupulously and with the independence of mind that everyone knows. So I will exercise that role responsibly in Singapore's interests.
He says this comes with experience and expertise after being in government for a long time, calling it a relationship built on trust and mutual respect.
Okay, let's check in on the latest at the nomination centre. Tan Soo-hui is tracking the developments for us. Soo-hui, get us up to speed on what's been happening so far.
All 3 men have submitted their nomination papers. We understand they've also left the nomination place right there. That's the auditorium where they submitted their documents. This includes their political donation certificate, certificate of eligibility, the community declaration certificate, as well as a deposit of $40,500. And now we're in this crucial period where we're waiting for all the nomination papers to be filed on the notice boards behind me. And right now they're all empty. But when they're out, all parties will have to scrutinize the details, NRIC, names, occupations, and if they see any discrepancies, they must file or raise an objection by 12 noon, which the returning officer would approve. Now, we will also be looking out for symbols that hasn't been revealed to the public yet. 8 approved symbols so far, but what we know is that Mr. Tharman and Mr. Tan Kin Lian, they have submitted for their symbols to be approved, and we are waiting for that. Now, this is really for a more inclusive election. So really, anticipation all round. All the journalists here alongside me, we are waiting for this crucial period at the moment.
All right, Soo-hui, thank you very much for that update.
So what exactly does a president do? Most first-time voters in Singapore understand the roles and functions, but they are less clear about his or her working relationship with Parliament. And that's according to a survey by CNA and Today, which saw responses from more than 1,500 citizens aged 21 to 33. Here are some of the findings. Over 80% of Singaporeans are aware of the president's role. That is, to safeguard national reserves and grant approval for the government to access these funds. About 3/4 of Singaporeans are aware that should the president refuse to give access, Parliament can still overturn his or her decision. When it comes to investigations on corrupt practices or the detention of individuals deemed a security threat, most are aware that the president can overrule the government's decisions. Sound awareness as well that while the president can veto certain decisions by the government, the head of state cannot advance his or her own policy agenda. Singaporeans also know that the president is the final approval for key appointments within the public sector and government-linked companies. But there's uncertainty when it comes to legislation. more than 40% of the survey respondents are unaware the president has no power to change existing laws. Some Singaporeans are also uncertain about the president's relationships with cabinet and parliament. Around 2/3 know that the president generally takes instructions only from the cabinet but not from parliament. Both the cabinet and parliament also don't report to the president.
I'll just note that survey was conducted between May and June this year before the writ of election was issued. Now, the last contested presidential election was, of course, in 2011. Now, this time, should there be a contest, there will be a sizable number of first-time presidential election voters, those between the ages of 21 and 33, and naturalized citizens. So let's explore how the candidates are wooing young voters and using social media to level the playing field. Let's speak to Eugene again. Eugene, let's get a sense of the number of first-time voters this time around, and what's your best estimate and why will they be pivotal?
When we look at first-time presidential election voters, right, I think that the number to me would be close to 500,000 out of 2.7 million voters. And how do I arrive at 500,000? If we take each cohort size to be on average about 40,000, it's been 12 years since the last presidential election, so that's just back of the envelope sort of calculation. But what is clear is that no candidate can win by just tapping on the youth, the young voters or first-time voters. But they are appealing, right? Simply because I think they are more amenable to messaging from the various candidates, right? The idea that they are going to give everyone a fair hearing. Social media is something that young voters are very comfortable with, and that has been reflected in how the candidates have been, the hopefuls so far have been very focused on social media. And I think there is also, the perception, that they are perhaps, less supportive of someone from the establishment or from a political party, or formerly from a political party. But I think it's important not to overstate these attributes, right? Because they are really perceptions. And I think at the end of the day, they too have the same concerns as other voters, right? The survey that Glenda just took us through, demonstrated that voters generally have a reasonably good understanding. And so they would want to be able to find out, and determine for themselves, who best fits the bill, based on all the different criteria. And of course, that would vary from person to person. But I think, the view that they might be leaning towards one candidate or the other, I think is perhaps not borne out in my mind. But we are looking at first-time voters who like other voters as well also relish this opportunity. You and I definitely are looking forward to the 1st of September because I think it is an important expression, right? And I recall, right, the first time when I voted in the presidential election, and that was in 1993, well, quite a long time ago, I remember, the sort of sense of, that this is an important vote, right? People often think, well, one vote doesn't make a difference, right? But imagine if 2.7 million people were to think that the same way, we are going to have quite a different outcome altogether. So I would say, the young voters matter, but they are not sufficient to get a candidate across the finishing line first.
All right. Thank you, Eugene. We'll get back to you after this break.
We are going for a short break, but don't go anywhere as we track the latest developments from the nomination centre to find out how the contest will shape up. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, plenty of action already happening this nomination day for Singapore's presidential election. We're halfway through the crucial nomination window, which opened at 11 a.m. All three hopefuls have submitted their nomination documents. Now, we've already seen Mr. Tan Kin Lian enter the nomination place, as well as Mr. Ng Kok Song. And we're hearing that Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam has already left it. Now, that's a smaller room inside the centre where they have until noon to hand in their documents. And that's also the cut-off point for them to correct any errors or omissions in them. Accepted nomination papers will then be put up on a notice board. Other hopefuls and their teams can inspect each other's papers and raise objections until 12:30, 12 o'clock. The papers can also be viewed by the media, and that's how we will also be giving you updates.
Live to Tan Si-hui now, first from inside the nomination building. So Si-hui, as we heard, all three men have submitted their papers. What's happening now?
You're right. All the nomination papers have been filed, but we're really waiting for the nomination papers to be displayed at the notice board behind me, but none of them have been displayed yet. So we're really waiting eagerly to see these nomination papers. That's because all parties will be able to inspect all of the details. This includes the NRIC numbers, names, occupations of the proposers, seconder, assenters, as well as the presidential hopefuls themselves. And we're also looking for their symbols. And so all of us anxiously waiting, and we will bring you the details and the live updates.
All right, thank you very much, Si-hui, for those updates. Tan Si-hui live from the nomination centre.
And here are some of the key timings that we'll be marking over the next few hours. So 11 a.m. was the first milestone. That's when the nomination window opened. Qualified candidates will need to file their papers within the hour. Noon is the cutoff. At this point, if there's only one candidate nominated, the returning officer will declare that person elected to the office of president. If there is more than one nomination, we'll have to wait half an hour more for the announcement of a contested election. And that's because the hopefuls' teams and the returning officer himself, now they have up to 12:30 p.m. to raise any objections. It could be for a variety of reasons, such as a missing documentation or incorrect particulars. If no objections are filed, the returning officer will announce a contest, paving the way for polls on the 1st of September. The floor will then be passed to the candidates. They'll each be allowed to make a short speech with a strict time limit of 2 minutes, after which the campaign period commences.
Let's bring back Associate Professor Eugene Tan. Eugene, let's talk about what's new this time around. The contest is open to all races, and Singaporeans, as you mentioned, want to be able to have that choice because they didn't get to last time in 2017. And this time, more will get to have their say as well.
Oh, definitely, right? I mean, we are looking at, a larger voting population of about 2.7 million. And we're looking at, as we discussed earlier, quite a substantial number of young and or first-time voters. But I think over the years, the elections department have also been trying to make the whole voting process more inclusive.
We're going to have to just stop you there shortly. We're looking at live pictures now, and we're seeing a set of papers that are going up on the board, and we understand it is that of Mr. Tan Kin Lian.
That's right. Earlier on, we know that all three candidates already submitted their papers. Of course, the elections department has had a look at them, and the returning officer as well, and they are now being put up on the board.
Once again, we understand that this set of papers is that of presidential hopeful Mr. Tan Kin Lian.
Well, if you're just joining us live, this is the presidential contest in Singapore. We are monitoring for you.
All right, we saw two officers. They've posted Mr. Tan Kin Lian's nomination papers on the board. He's the first one to be up on the board. Now we see a list of proposers, the seconder as well as the assenters. They have all their signatures as well. Now we also see the signature of the nominee. Now we also see another 2 officers coming up. I can see that it is that of Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. Now his nomination papers, the second to be up, also has the proposer, seconder, and his assenters up there. Now we know that the proposer is Mr. Thomas Chua. He is the Chinese Clan Association president. Seconder would be Alami Musa. He is the former president of MUIS. Now, we are also looking for the symbols. Now, I'm trying to see if the symbol has been placed up there. And at the moment, I can't see that yet, but it seems that all of the information is clear right there. The names, signatures, the dates. Now, we're just really waiting for the last one to be filed, and that is Mr. Ng Kok Song's nomination papers. So we will be eagerly waiting for that. Shortly after, all parties will get to scrutinize the details. And it seems that the final nomination papers are being placed on the notice board. We understand that would be Mr. Ng Kok Song's nomination papers. We know that his proposer is Mr. Kwa Wee Gee. It is a co-founder of his investment company. His seconder would be Dr. Carol Tan, who is from... Okay, what we see also is Mr. Ng Kok Song's fiancée, Sybil Lau. She is scrutinizing the details of Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam's nomination papers. It seems that she has not raised any objections yet. Shortly after, we will also be waiting for the other people to come out to check the details. Ms. Sybil Lau is nodding her head. And then now she's moving on to Mr. Tan Kin Lian's nomination papers. Now, they will have up to 12:30 to raise the objections. Mr. Tang Mingdui, who is the returning officer, he will have to approve the objections if he finds or deems them appropriate. Now, Ms. Sybil Lau, she's looking at her own fiancé's nomination papers. Now, another person is looking at Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam's papers. He is also now looking at Mr. Tan Kin Lian's papers, but we will bring to you more updates right here.
All right, thank you very much. That was Tan Soo-hui live from the Nomination Centre. And just to summarize what she said earlier on, Tan Kin Lian's nomination papers were the first to go up on the board at 11:36 a.m. After that, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, or Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, at 11:37 a.m. And the last one to go up on the board was Mr. Ng Kok Song, 11:38 a.m. Linda?
And they have until 12:30 before we really know whether any of the documents have any objections to them or not. And we know that this is the crucial time period, 1 hour from now.
So, Eugene, let's get back to you. Take us through how they and their teams would have gone over everything with a very fine-tooth comb.
I think they will have to go through it very carefully, because the last thing you want, is to be disqualified on the basis of an error in the papers that cannot be corrected in time. So it's no surprise that we see the candidates submitting their papers before 11:30. So this gives them ample time. And so I think what you see really people looking at the notice boards. I think they are really just looking at it casually. I don't think they're going to nitpick, unless there is a significant error. For example, the proposer, the seconder, center, they must be on the electoral register, right? And due diligence would have required that each candidate, would have gone through that. So I think I'll be surprised, if someone gets disqualified, on a technicality.
So saying that, what's the reason for allowing this as part of the process if, everyone would, as we assume, would go through it with a fine-tooth comb? I mean, I'm assuming the returning officer himself would have also gone through the documents.
Oh, definitely. I think the heaviest responsibility we place on the returning officer, right? Because he has the final say, and certainly he's not going to count on what each candidate say of the others, and so he will scrutinize it, very carefully. So every information that is required by law, will have to be put in. Every declaration that must be signed off, will also have to be signed off. So this is an important process, right? Because much as I may have given the impression there's a formality, it is the candidate here saying that these are the information about me. They do meet the requirements that are spelled out in law. I have submitted all the relevant documents, in particular, the certificate of eligibility as well as the political donation certificate. So all this, sets the stage, for candidates, who can contest, to contest, and I think that's an important process.
So you talked about the returning officer. He has a very important role right now. He can raise objections. He can also give candidates the chance to correct any mistakes that they have made. What are some of the errors within this context that could have that room for rectification? Well,
I think we're talking about, what some might say, clerical errors, right? Errors such as, getting the birth date wrong, let's say, for example. I think what would be more difficult, would be the non-clerical errors. So, for example, let's say the seconder is not on the electoral register, and the question is whether, they would be able to correct it in time, get somebody else, to come in with all the particulars. But we can expect, the candidates to have done due diligence, right? And if they do falter, then I think it raises legitimate questions about whether they are ready to contest.
Right. Once again, we're looking at live pictures now from the People's Association's headquarters, and this is inside the nomination centre. And we have the nomination papers up on the board. All three hopefuls' nomination papers are up. Mr. Tan Kin Lian's was the first, followed by Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam and Mr. Ng Kok Song. And we know that they have until 12:30 for any objections to be made.
Yes, and the returning officer is the one that will approve any objections that are raised. So, Eugene, Mr. Tharman, Mr. Ng, Mr. Tan, let's say all of them get the green light. Everything goes very smoothly. The next hurdle will be for them to adhere to very strict campaigning rules. Take us through the key points we should pay attention to this time.
I think in terms of campaigning, I think one of the key aspects is that, the presidential election campaigning is actually quite different from a parliamentary general election, right? Simply because, the candidates will not have an election manifesto or something similar to it, right? Because they have no policy platforms, to sell or to canvass to voters. I have previously described, election contest as very much a battle of the CVs. Because we're looking at, their track record, their attributes to see how well, they are prepared for the job. But, we will still see the campaigning that is very similar to a parliamentary general election, such as walkabouts. And given that we now live in an age where social media is ubiquitous, we can certainly expect, lots of things to go on social media as well. But if we talk in terms of the rules, I think, the Elections Department has indicated that given the nature of the presidential election, fiscal rallies are not encouraged. They are not prohibited, right? I think that there was some confusion, a week or so earlier. But fiscal rallies are permitted. but it raises the question of, what's going to happen, at a fiscal rally, because we must remember, the elections the campaigning must also be keeping, with the dignity and the decorum of the office that the candidates are vying for, right? And what I'm referring to here is, the president as the unifying figure. And so if the candidates in the course of their campaigning were to engage in very divisive electioneering, getting people all agitated, for example, then I think it raises very legitimate questions about whether a candidate who takes a very confrontational approach will be able to be that unifying figure. We also have very strict rules this time, which I think are appropriate, because they seek to deal with providing transparency and accountability. So here I'm referring to, the need for campaign advertisements to specify, who's involved, who's funding it, because this is crucial, right? Because a candidate should not be a front for somebody else, whether it's an entity or, and in today's age, we are also concerned about foreign interference. Now, this is not the stuff of movies, right? We have seen elections in America, in the UK and all, being affected by foreign interference, so there are rules as well, in place, to ensure, that foreign interference is protected. But it's not foolproof, right? So the elections department has sent out advisories, to the candidates, to ensure, that their computer systems, will not be hacked. So it is really a collective responsibility in that sense.
Right. Thanks for that, Prof. Tan. Once again, we know that the nomination papers, they are up on the nomination board. And if all three candidates have no objections, the returning officer can announce the results even before 12 o'clock. So we'll be waiting for that.
Yes, we will. And we will be keeping also a close eye on nomination proceedings here in Singapore for now. The rest of the day's news with Shahida Othman.
Thanks, Im. Now we have developments out of Thailand. Former Premier Thaksin Shinawatra has returned to the kingdom after more than 15 years in self-imposed exile. The private jet carrying the former leader touched down at Bangkok's Don Mueang Airport. He first bowed in homage to the Thai king's portrait before greeting supporters outside the terminal, along with his daughter, Petongtan Shinawatra. Thaksin was then led back inside by officials. He had originally planned to return on 10th of August, but delayed his flight for a medical checkup. The former Prime Minister faces up to 10 years in prison for cases he was tried for in absentia. Saksit Sayasombat explains why the former Prime Minister's return is so significant.
For the past 20 years, ever since he became Prime Minister in the early 2000s, Thaksin Shinawatra had an impact on Thai politics for better or worse. And today is no different because, first of all, otherwise we wouldn't be still talking about him. And secondly, there wouldn't be such a big fuss here at Don Mueang International Airport at the private jet terminal. What can we expect to happen to him? Well, I mean, he has been sentenced to 10 years in prison in total in 3 different cases in absentia, ranging from abuse of power to corruption. So the police are definitely going to welcome him, not necessarily with open arms, but with an arrest warrant. Will be greeted by the police, and then he will be immediately sent to a judge and then will be detained in the prison. The question, of course, is that how long will he stay in prison? How long will he have to remain in there? Can he seek a royal pardon? Will this pardon be granted very quickly? These are all the questions that are surrounding his arrival. Obviously, he wouldn't make his return if there haven't been some assurances made to him. And of course, that has an impact not only on himself, but also on the political scene here.
Mr. Thaksin's return coincides with a parliament vote for a new prime minister, which is taking place right now. The Thaksin-backed Partai yesterday unveiled an 11-party coalition, which includes former military-linked rivals. The move has been heavily criticized by some of its supporters. They say Partai is backtracking on a pre-election pledge that they will not join hands with pro-military parties. The party has nominated property tycoon Seta Tavisin for the premiership. And earlier we spoke with Eric Martinez Kohonta, Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University, on the likelihood of Mr. Seta securing the country's top job.
His chances look pretty good. He has a coalition of about 11 parties, 314 seats in the lower house, and you need to have both houses, Senate and the lower house, for a total vote of half of 750 seats. So that's 376 seats to 376 votes to become prime minister. So 314 in the lower house. So he needs about 62 seats from the Senate. The senators are appointed from the military, so they are very conservative. The fact that the coalition now, as it has been proposed in the past few days, includes among its members 2 parties linked to the military, this is a deal that has been made, means that it is likely that this coalition in the lower house will get the support in the Senate. And that is crucial for this new prime minister to go through from Pheu Thai. But a recent development just a few days ago is that the Prime Minister of Canada of Pheu Thai has now been accused of some ethical issues when he was a head of a major real estate firm. And of course, they rejected those ethical charges from this very famous whistleblower. But that is now roiling the scene, and we'll see how this develops.
And a quick check on the markets in Thailand. Thai equities trading in the green, while the Thai baht strengthening slightly. That is with investors hoping for a resolution to the leadership question as Parliament votes for a new prime minister today. Cambodia's parliament has voted to confirm ruler Hun Sen's eldest son as prime minister. The development completes a dynastic handover of power after last month's election. Hun Sen's Cambodian People's Party won all but 5 of 125 seats in the lower house in recent elections. But the vote was widely criticized by the international community as the main opposition party was barred from running. Following the win, Mr. Hun Sen announced he is handing power to his eldest son, Hun Manet. The Cambodian king, who holds a largely symbolic role, convened parliament yesterday. And this paved the way for lawmakers to endorse Hun Manet as the country's new leader. The new government includes a number of Hun Manet's relatives and allies in top jobs. Mr. Hun Sen is expected to become president of the Senate next year and acting head of state when the king is overseas. Japan will start releasing treated radioactive water from the wrecked Fukushima nuclear power plant into the Pacific from Thursday.
東京電力に対しては原子力規制委員会の認可を受けた計画に基づき、速やかに海洋放出開始に向けた準備を進めるよう求め、具体的な放出時期については気象海象条件に支障がなければ8月24日を見込みます。
The water is set to be released into the ocean at a maximum rate of 500,000 litres per day. Japan insists the gradual release is safe. That's a view backed by the UN Atomic Agency. However, the discharge plan has faced strong opposition both locally and from regional neighbours, including China. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has called on North Korea to cease its satellite launch after it informed Tokyo of its plan for some time this week. Mr. Kishida says he has instructed his government to work with the US, South Korea, and other nations to urge its cancellation. The planned blast-off is likely to be a retry of a military satellite launch which failed in May. That space module was described by North Korean authorities as the country's first strategic reconnaissance satellite to be put into orbit, but it plunged into the sea minutes after launch. South Korean Navy later recovered the equipment fragments for analysis and confirmed they had no military utility. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has long prioritized the development of a military spy satellite. He says it is a necessary counterbalance to the growing U.S. military presence in the region. Meanwhile, the country's state media, KCNA, has slammed the ongoing annual military drills between the U.S. and South Korea. It also warned that the recent trilateral agreements to deepen ties between the two countries and Japan could lead to what it calls a thermonuclear war. BRICS nations are set to begin their annual summit today in Johannesburg. Now, the bloc is made up of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It represents a quarter of the global economy and around 40% of the world's population. Top of the agenda for the three-day summit is a proposed expansion to the group and a reinforcement of the bloc's alliance as a counterbalance to the West.
This summit is going to be special in that it marks 15 years of summit. But more importantly, this summit is taking place at a very critical moment in time when we have major global challenges. And the world is looking to BRICS leaders and the BRICS summit to address positively some of these challenges.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is hosting his Chinese and Brazilian counterparts Xi Jinping and Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and also Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Russian President Vladimir Putin will not be traveling to Johannesburg. He will instead attend the summit virtually because of the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant against him. South Africa is a member of the ICC. Officials say at least 40 countries have shown interest in becoming members. 23 of them have formally submitted their applications. But the proposed expansion of BRICS has caused division among key members. South Africa, Russia, and China want to see the group grow. But India has expressed concerns that the bloc might evolve into an anti-Western platform. As the BRIC representatives gather for the annual meeting in Johannesburg, Greater China markets trading mixed, with the Hang Seng rebounding from a 7-day losing streak. The Chinese central bank set the yuan midpoint more firmly than analysts were expecting again, ramping up its fight to support the currency amid a faltering economic recovery. Now, chip designer ARM has filed for what is expected to be the year's largest U.S. initial public offering. SoftBank Semiconductor Unit plans to list on the NASDAQ. The highly anticipated debut is seen as a potential catalyst to lift the IPO market out of a slow patch. The UK-based company did not disclose proposed terms, but reports suggest it is looking to raise $8 billion to $10 billion in the IPO. Bloomberg sources say it is aiming for a valuation of up to $70 billion. Now, the report adds that ARM plans to start its roadshow in the first week of September and price the IPO the following week. The listing is set to be the largest in the U.S. since electric vehicle maker Rivian Automotive's nearly $14 billion offering in October 2021. ARM is one of the world's most important chip companies, with its designs found in nearly all smartphones. SoftBank shares trading more than 2.5% up on investor optimism over the listing. The heavyweight is driving gains to the broader market. And those are the business and world news from me. Glenda, back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Shah. We are now in the closing minute of the crucial nomination window here in Singapore. The 1-hour period closes at noon. The nomination papers of all three presidential hopefuls are up on the notice board. That's former GIC Chief Investment Officer Mr. Ng Kok Song, former NTUC Income Chief Mr. Tan Kin Lian, and former Senior Minister Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. And you're looking at the stage where the returning officer will announce the nominated candidates later on.
And we're checking in once again on the nomination centre here in Singapore. Lauren Ong joins us now. Lauren, the nomination papers are up on the notice board. Tell us what you're seeing, what's happening right now.
Well, Glenda, as you said, the nomination process has just closed. And since the nomination papers are up on the three notice boards, and we are now expecting the returning officer to go on that stage to announce who has been successfully nominated. Over the past half an hour, I've seen assenters, seconders come up to the notice board to inspect and scrutinize, if anything, if there's any issues with the nomination papers, and we'll know if there's any issue when the returning officer gets on that stage. And from where I'm at, the corridor behind me leads to where the stage is, and from this vantage point, I can hear some kerfuffle, some cheers as well. So we will definitely be waiting what will happen outside.
All right, thank you very much, Lauren. Lauren Ong live there from the Nomination Centre.
Rival candidates and their backers can scrutinize a nomination paper and raise objections. The returning officer can also do so. So, what could lead to an objection? For starters, this could happen if the nomination paper is filled with so many errors that the candidate cannot be identified, or if the occupation is missing. Another reason could be if the candidate, proposer, seconder, and at least 4 assenters do not appear in person. And it's the same case if the 6 don't sign the form or if their particulars are not found in the register of electors. Another cause for an objection: missing documents such as the certificate of eligibility, a political donation certificate, or the community certificate, or an incomplete statutory declaration in the nomination paper. Finally, even if the papers are in order, the candidate must remember to pay the deposit of 40,500 Sing dollars to qualify. Ultimately, it's up to the returning officer to allow an objection. If it can't be rectified, it could mean the candidate is out of the race.
Let's bring Associate Professor Eugene Tan back into the conversation. Eugene, earlier we were chatting a bit about the symbols that the candidates will choose to represent them. Why is this important?
The symbols are perhaps, a hangover from, the much older days, if I can put it that way, where some voters may not be literate, and so symbols become a way of ensuring, that these voters would still be able to vote for their preferred candidate. But increasingly, right, so in today's context, where people can read the English language, they can know the names and all, symbols have taken on perhaps a different context. I mean, they really, I think candidates will want to use their symbols, to send a message, as to what their campaign is all about. So if you recall in the 2011 general election, Dr. Tony Tan used his trademark glasses. I mean, that was something that, the same sort of rimmed glasses that he wore, over the many years in politics, that's something that easily, identified him, But you also have others, who might use, a heart shape, because they want to convey the message that they care or they're concerned about Singaporeans. So it remains to be seen, right? The Elections Department, right, have approved 8 symbols, right? But these are really generic symbols, right? They are not intended to convey any political messaging. So a candidate could choose to use one of those 8 approved symbols, but I think most of them would want to use that opportunity of their symbol because it will appear on all their campaign paraphernalia, on their banners and all. And use that, to promote, whatever key message, they want voters to take with them as they head to the polls.
All right, Prof. Tan. Well, let's go to Se Hui, because she's joining us from inside the nomination building right now. Se Hui, some movement at the notice board in the past few minutes. Tell us about that.
So all the nomination papers are filed. They're on the notice board. Now, the officers earlier, they came and stuck symbols that have been approved to the candidates' forms. And what we see right now, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, his symbol is that of a pineapple. And right here, behind me, would be Tan Kin Lian's symbol of 4 people holding up what looks like a flower or a sun. What we understand is that he wants to champion the multi-ethnic society in Singapore. And the final symbol that we can see from here is Ng Kok Song's. It shows a hand, like a palm. He previously talked about meditation, and he says that mental health is very important, and we believe that's the reason behind the symbol. We still don't know what the pineapple stands for Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, but we will be getting all of these updates to you live.
All right, many thanks there for that, Tan Se Hui, with that update. Now we're going for a short break, but don't go anywhere as we track the latest developments from the nomination centre to find out how the contest will shape up.
Welcome back to CNA's Nomination Day special for Singapore's presidential election. The nomination window has now closed and we are tracking if any objections will be filed.
Well, the nomination papers of all three presidential hopefuls are up on the notice board. And that's former GIC Chief Investment Officer, Mr. Ng Kok Song, former NTUC Income Chief, Mr. Tan Kin Lian, and former Senior Minister, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam.
And you're looking at the stage where the returning officer will announce the nominated candidates. These are live pictures from the People's Association headquarters here in Singapore.
In the lead up to today, the three hopefuls have been giving glimpses into the causes and topics they will champion as head of state.
Presidential hopeful Tharman Shanmugaratnam says he'll work to support organizations that seek to deepen the culture of respect for different groups of people. And he's also said that creating a more inclusive society is not just for policymakers.
I think it should be Singaporeans even closer together. Each of us with our own religions, own cultures, but closer together. Those who are poorer don't feel so far away from those who are middle class or those who are rich. And those who are rich and middle class want to be closer to those who are poorer. Everyone must feel more Singaporean. I believe we can achieve it.
Mr. Tharman adds that the role of the presidency is pivotal in a more uncertain, diverse and contested environment. He says it's not just a symbolic role and that he plans to support initiatives on the ground to bring people together.
These are, in fact, going to be major challenges that we face in Singapore in the future, and which the government, of course, has to address, but the president as head of state can also play a very useful role in. And if I'm fortunate enough to be elected, of course, given my own standing internationally, I intend to be quite active in that respect.
Meanwhile, Mr. Ng Kok Song told the media he's going to focus on the younger generation. He says he's active on social media to reach out to them and give them assurance about Singapore's future.
I want to tell the younger generation, do not despair, do not be pessimistic. We have a good future. Singapore has a good future. But the younger people must develop certain skills for us to be able to capture the opportunities ahead of us, to have good jobs.
He says one of the skills he wants the youth to pick up includes how to save money and how to invest. Mr. Ng also says there are other skills the youth ought to have to thrive in the world today.
I like to be able to share with the younger people how to meditate. I like to meditate with them, because that's the best way of teaching and encouraging them to meditate. The second thing that I would like to do as president, I want to encourage younger Singaporeans to develop the skill of public speaking.
In contrast, Tan Kin Lian, or Mr. Tan Kin Lian, has on more than one occasion said he would influence public policy through his interactions with the Prime Minister and ministers. He also said he believes people who support the opposition in Singapore are firmly behind him.
Beyond these constitutional duties, I have a vision to use the President's office to influence policies that will make a better life for the people of Singapore. I will focus on three fundamental areas crucial to the well-being of our citizens: bringing down the cost of living, ensuring affordable housing for all, and securing jobs that provide a sense of stability and a path to progress. Now, I must clarify that I don't intend to be an adversary to the elected government.
While he was greeting residents at Chong Pang, he had again said he would advocate for shorter national service periods and more allowances. Mr. Tan also said that he would try to get CPF monies out earlier for older Singaporeans. At Kampong Admiralty, he shared that one reason he wasn't happy with the current government was the lack of toilet signs in housing estates.
I send so many suggestions on day-to-day life. They ignore me. For whatever reason, they ignore me. Just now, I created a Facebook Live. I was looking for a toilet. I walked around the whole ground floor of this Kampong Admiralty. There is no sign of a toilet. I asked people, where is the toilet? They don't know. Elderly people need the toilet. Even younger people need the toilet. Of course, I see a lot of signs of the shops. Yes, shops are important, can make money, but people need the toilet. Put some sign. I know the toilets are around, but don't make people walk round and round.
Let's bring Associate Professor Eugene Tan back into the conversation. So, Eugene, the candidates have many issues and different issues that they want to champion. We just heard from Mr. Tan Kin Lian about how he wants more feedback, or he wants his feedback to be heard by the government. Let's look at the age of the candidates now. Mr. Ng is almost 75 years old. Ms. Tan Kin Lian is also 75, and Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, 66. To what extent would age play a part in attracting votes? Because all of them want the younger vote, of course, as well.
Yeah, so ultimately, it's really about, who appeals to the different age groups. I don't think, given that they're all roughly in the same age group, all above 65, if we use that as a sort of a guideline, that the age of the candidates are going to make a difference to voters. The Constitution requires that a presidential candidate be at least 45 years of age. And I think that's simply because, life experiences, certain that will enable the candidate to have a track record. But beyond that, I think it really boils down to who can appeal. And I think this is where age doesn't really play a part. Right? And I don't think we would regard any of the candidates as being too old, simply because people are living much longer lives, and the candidates don't seem to have, any particular health issues that we know of. So I think the age will not play a big part in the voters' decision-making process.
But then, Prof. Tan, so to what extent can presidential hopefuls, these candidates, to what extent can they influence their policies or their champions? Because they have many issues. To what extent can they actually, get it done?
Well, I think, the president will have the biggest amount of influence, in relation to the community roles, right? So whether it's Mr. Ng wanting to champion public speaking for young people or meditation skills for young people, or Mr. Tharman, trying to inculcate, a respect, for all, regardless of one's class, religion, and all race, in Singapore. But I think in terms of trying to influence, the government when it relates to policy matters, I think that is where, the Constitution doesn't provide for this role for the president. I mentioned earlier about how important it is, for the president to be able to command the trust and confidence of the elected government of the day. And that is where, the president could perhaps, try to engage the government, provide cogent reasons why, the government should consider a particular policy or perspective. But I think to say, for example, that, that as president, Mr. Tan Kin Lian wants to reduce the period of national service, provide for more national service allowances, I think that power doesn't exist. And I don't think, right, he can even influence the government at all. And I think this is important, right, because we are going to see in the course of the campaigning, this ratcheting up of, promises, and if you look at what the candidates, the hopefuls have said so far, both Mr. Tharman and Mr. Ng have been very careful, right? They have not gone into policy prescriptions, criticizing government policies and all, because that's not the role of the president. The president has no such powers. So I think it's important, right? Because, the candidate would have signed a declaration that they have understood, the roles and the powers of the president. And I think it's important that, candidates campaign for an office that exists as provided for in the Constitution and not one, that they seek to make of. Because I think that would be misleading voters. And I think, it would give, the contest a totally different character. And here I'm referring to, effectively politicizing, the presidential election.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Prof. Tan. We're going to just, leave it at that because we're still keeping a close eye on nomination proceedings here in Singapore.
And for now, we have the rest of the day's news. And Shahida Othman joins us with the latest. Shahida?
Thanks, UM. Thailand's former Premier Thaksin Shinawatra has returned to the kingdom after more than 15 years in self-imposed exile. Saksit Sayasombat explains why the former Prime Minister's return is so significant.
The arrival of fugitive former Thai Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra was one of the most anticipated and politically charged plane spotting in recent Thai history. He arrived at Don Mueang Airport on Tuesday morning on a private jet from Singapore and was greeted by family members and also members of the Pheu Thai party. He was once a leader of one of the predecessor parties when he was Prime Minister in the early 2000s until he was toppled by military coup in 2006. Now, he was also expected by the police. They were not welcoming him with open arms, but with an arrest warrant. He was convicted to over 10 years in prison for various charges ranging from corruption to abuse of power. That all happened in absentia, and he says that all these cases were politically motivated. What happens next is that he will be presented in front of a judge and then detained. The question is, of course, how long will he spend time in prison? Will he be seeking a royal pardon? Will he get a royal pardon? And how soon will that happen? Now, observers say that he wouldn't come back to Thailand if he's not confident enough that he will spend the least amount of time in prison and will be as comfortable as possible during his time of detention. Now, this coincides with the Prime Minister vote in Parliament today. The Pheu Thai party has now cobbled together an 11-party coalition, including parties of the outgoing government, including parties that are linked to the previous military coups of 2006 and 2014. Both these military coups have toppled not only Thaksin's government, but also the government of his sister, Prime Minister Ng Kok Song, both the Pheu Thai party. And that is something that not a lot of observers would have expected, but it's basically a 180 turn based on their own campaign promises, saying that they will not join hands with these two parties. But here we are, and they did. It is expected that party is going to put forward and nominate their Prime Minister candidate, former property tycoon Seta Tawisin, and it is expected that he will get enough votes to be confirmed as Prime Minister. These two events, of course, the Pheu Thai party is saying they are not related to each other. It has nothing to do with one another. But given the history of Thai politics, given Thaksin's influence on the political discourse for the past 20 years, nothing happens without coincidence, nothing happens without a plan. Whether or not this plan of Thaksin to return to Thailand safe and unharmed is playing out, while also getting a Pheu Thai government, that remains to be seen. Saksit Sayasombat, CNA Bangkok.
And Mr. Thaksin's return coincides with the parliament vote for a new prime minister, which is taking place right now. The Thaksin-backed Pheu Thai has nominated property tycoon Seta Tawisin for the premiership. The party yesterday unveiled an 11-party coalition, which includes former military-linked rivals. The move has been heavily criticized by some of its supporters. They say Pheu Thai is backtracking on a pre-election pledge that they will not join hands with pro-military parties. We spoke with Eric Martinez Cojonta, Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University, on the likelihood of Mr. Seta securing the country's top job.
His chances look pretty good. He has a coalition of about 11 parties, 314 seats in the lower house, and you need to have both houses, Senate and the lower house, for a total vote of half of 750 seats, so that's 376 seats to 376 votes to become prime minister. So 314 in the lower house, so he needs about 62 seats from the Senate. The senators are appointed from the military, so they are very conservative. The fact that the coalition now, as it has been proposed in the past few days, includes among its members 2 parties linked to the military, this is a deal that has been made, means that it is likely that this coalition in the lower house will get the support in the Senate. And that is crucial for this new prime minister to go through from Pheu Thai. But a recent development just a few days ago is that the Prime Minister Canada of Pheu Thai has now been accused of some ethical issues when he was a head of a major real estate firm. And of course, they've rejected those ethical charges from this very famous whistleblower. But that is now roiling the scene, and we'll see how this develops.
South Korea has urged its northern neighbor not to go through with its planned launch of a military satellite. Seoul says Pyongyang's so-called launch would be an illegal act and is a clear violation of UN Security Council resolutions, as it would require the use of banned ballistic missile technology. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has also called on the North to cease the satellite launch after it informed Tokyo of its plan for some time this week. Mr. Kishida says he has instructed his government to work with the US, South Korea, and other nations to urge its cancellation. The planned blast-off is likely to be a retry of a military satellite launch which failed in May. That space module was described by North Korean authorities as the country's first strategic reconnaissance satellite to be put into orbit. But it plunged into the sea minutes after launch. The South Korean Navy later recovered the equipment fragments for analysis and confirmed they had no military utility. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has long prioritized the development of a military spy satellite. He says it is a necessary counterbalance to the growing U.S. military presence in the region. Meanwhile, the country's state media, KCNA, has slammed the ongoing annual military drills between the U.S. and South Korea. It also warned that the recent trilateral agreements to deepen ties between the two countries and Japan could lead to what it calls a thermonuclear war. Japan will start releasing treated radioactive water from the wrecked Fukushima nuclear power plant into the Pacific from Thursday.
東京電力に対しては原子力規制委員会の認可を受けた計画に基づき、速やかに海洋放出開始に向けた準備を進めるよう求め、具体的な放出時期については気象海象条件に支障がなければ8月24日を見込みます。
The water is set to be released into the ocean at a maximum rate of 500,000 liters per day. Japan insists the gradual release is safe. That's a view backed by the UN Atomic Agency. However, the discharge plan has faced strong opposition, both locally and from regional neighbors, including China. Parts of Southern California are bracing for more potentially life-threatening floods triggered by Hillary. The storm was the first in 84 years to make landfall in the region, dumping record rain that damaged roads and power lines. Now, tens of thousands of people have lost access to electricity. Hillary weakened to a tropical storm from a hurricane over the weekend before being downgraded to a post-tropical storm overnight. But authorities warn that they're not out of the woods yet. It's now moving through the western U.S., where flood watches are in effect until tomorrow morning. Residents in affected areas are still grappling with the impact of the unprecedented deluge. Dozens of schools were forced to close and thousands of flights delayed or cancelled, with millions urged to stay indoors. No major damage has been reported, although the storm uprooted trees and inundated desert towns. Several people were swept into swollen rivers, while others were trapped in their vehicles. Forecasters are warning of another tropical storm, this time headed for Texas. It is expected to hit the southern part of the state's coast tomorrow and will be called Harold. It could dump up to 25 centimeters of rain in parts of the state and across Mexico. And that's all from me at the moment. Glenda, back to you.
Right, Shah, thank you very much for that update. And we are in the home stretch of nomination proceedings here. In Singapore, the deadline for objections for the hopefuls' nomination papers closes at 12:30 p.m. That's in under 1 minute.
And the returning officer, we know, will then announce the nominated candidates before each of them will be invited to make a speech. All right, let's bring Associate Professor Eugene Tan back into the conversation. Let's talk about campaigning. What are you expecting?
It's early days, right? So it's hard to say, but I think we will probably see, Mr. Ng and Mr. Tharman keeping very much to the tone, of the unofficial campaigning that they have done so far. Meaning, they will stick to what are the roles of the president, what are the powers, and essentially talk about why they would be suitable, to be president. I think the uncertainty would relate to Mr. Tan Kin Lian. Even in the unofficial campaigning, he has taken, a fairly strong approach, muscular, if I could put it that way, in the sense that, he is saying, well, if I'm president, these are the things I want to do, such as reduce the cost of living, look at job security, better, cheaper housing, which again, raises question of whether, is he contesting, in the right election, if I want to put it a bit more directly. So it depends, whether he's going to raise the ante, because as he indicated, right, he would want to garner, the so-called opposition votes. Now, there isn't, to my mind, in a presidential election, there isn't this opposition or non-opposition vote, right? Because the candidates don't contest on any particular party platform, right? No political party has endorsed, any of the candidates, and I think that's important, right? Because the president's office is non-partisan, right? The president is supposed to be a unifying figure, and you have to look back at Singapore's presidential history, how they played such an important role. President Yusof Ishak, in the throes of independence and all, Madam Halima, during the COVID crisis. So it is important, to recognize that. So, but with Mr. Tan also planning to have a rally, I don't know whether that's going to, result in things boiling over. But I think we all hope that, the candidates will recognize the dignity and decorum of the office, and also the critical role that the president plays as a unifying figure, right, above the political fray. So let's hope, they all keep to the dignity and decorum of the office that they're seeking to win the mandate from the people.
Well, speaking of this unifying figure, we know that they have, they're championing different issues, mental health, the youth. Do you think that perhaps maybe alienating some other population by, championing so much on the youth vote here?
I think that there is certainly a possibility if, let's say, certain voters feel that, certain voting segments feel that, oh, am I being ignored? And that is why I think, much as, they can't champion every cause, and so they're identifying, what is it that they would like to champion. But I would suppose that, in the course of the campaigning, they would want to have that broad-based appeal, right? Because in a very keenly contested election, and we shouldn't, exclude the possibility that this will be a keenly contested election. And I'm sure all the candidates are going to work on that basis, that every vote counts, and so candidates need to have that very broad-based appeal. They need to try to secure as many votes, from all the different voting populations, right? Whether it's the young, the elderly, homemakers, women, the unemployed, so everything is going to matter significantly, in the larger scheme of things. And I think what's crucial is that, the candidates in the course of their campaigning should not marginalize, any voting groups. That's important, right? Because once you do that, then I think the question of whether the president will have that broad-based appeal such that he could be the unifying figure, significant doubts will be raised in that regard.
And the president's role as a super diplomat representing Singapore on the world stage, Mr. Tharman is highlighting his heft in that arena. How much do you think this would appeal to voters, especially when perhaps not everyone may be so in touch or concerned with larger geopolitical issues?
I think certainly. Certainly, I think that's a valid consideration. I think in the end, for some voters, that role as the chief diplomat may take on heightened importance, right? But I think by and large, it is one of the key considerations. But I think it is important for voters to recognize that, even though the president doesn't make foreign policy, but because the president represents the country as Singapore's head of state, at key international events, flying the Singapore flag, and for a small nation state, being able to project, Singapore's voice, being able to promote and protect our national interests plays the important part. So we have, the foreign ministry, we have cabinet ministers, flying the Singapore flag. But I think, for a small state in a more volatile geopolitical environment, we need all hands on deck. And if we have a president, who can fly the flag high, just as all the current and previous presidents, I think that adds to, Singapore playing an important role in global affairs, right? And we're not trying to be a middle power or anything, right? But we are really there, to ensure, that small states' voices are given due consideration and that they are respected. And Mr. Tharman is essentially counting, on the fact that he has served on many international panels, such as the IMF and all, that what he says, will provide that heft. And Mr. Ng has also mentioned about how, in his role as Chief Investment Officer, he has gone on many trips abroad, for Singapore. And Mr. Tan, in his capacity as, one of the insurance organizations, international organizations, have also done these trips abroad.
Right. Well, once again, we're looking at live pictures now where we're waiting for the returning officer to announce the nominated candidates before we know each of them will be invited to make a speech. You're looking at live pictures there now, and we're just waiting. The time now is about 12:35. Prof. Tan, so, the hopefuls, the candidates, are going to be going into campaigning. Another issue let's talk about is election expenses, the money issue here. The maximum amount a candidate can spend is about $600,000, and that's about like 30 cents each elector. I mean, we're just doing a rough calculation in the registers of electors, right? How does this ensure a level playing field?
I think it does a lot, to have a level playing field, right? So unlike other countries where, it depends on how much campaign financing you can raise, and here we think of America as an example where they raise tens, if not hundreds of millions. In Singapore, we are trying to level the playing field, so that, the cost of running a campaign will not be prohibitive, right? So that lowers the barriers to entry, right? You don't need to have a big war chest, in order to contest in the presidential election. Because if you allow for unlimited campaign financing, right, then you will have this situation of candidates, having to raise funds, and when the donors are then going to expect something in return. I mean, no one's going to donate generously and hope and not ask for anything in return. So I think that levels the playing field. It more importantly, it avoids a situation where people can influence, the electioneering and promote their own causes.
Prof. Tan, we're going to have to stop here. Let's listen in. We have the returning officer now.
Presidential election 2023. Result of nominations. Mr. Ng Kok Song, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, and Mr. Tan Kin Lian are the candidates who have been nominated for the election to the office of President of the Republic of Singapore. As a returning officer, I hereby direct that the poll be conducted on the 1st of September 2023. May I now invite the contesting candidates to deliver their speeches. Each candidate has 2 minutes. Mr. Ng Kok Song, please.
My fellow Singaporeans, on National Day, we celebrated the 3 national treasures that define our country, Singapore, as exceptional. I'm standing for President to protect these 3 treasures. The first treasure is our reserves. I can protect the reserves. I spent my entire career at GIC and MAS helping to build up our reserves. Our second treasure is good public administration. I worked 45 years in public service. I have what it takes to uphold the integrity of public service appointments. Our third treasure is our social stability, where Singaporeans have lived in peace and harmony, regardless of race, religion, or political affiliation. I do not belong to any political party, and so I'm well placed to unite the people of Singapore to face an uncertain future. For these 3 reasons, I humbly ask you, my fellow Singaporeans, to choose me as your president. I am Ng Kok Song. 请你到我一票。Nama saya Ng Kok Song. Saya berharap Anda undilah saya. Nan Ng Kok Song. Nambaya Yuden. Yenuku Vatkali Yunggal. Thank you.
Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, please.
Saudara-saudari sekalian, Vanakkam, Saga Kudimakkale, Kawai Tongbao, fellow Singaporeans and friends. First, I'd like to thank my fellow candidates, Mr. Ng Kok Song and Mr. Tan Kin Lian, for joining me in this contest. I look forward to a fair, dignified and honourable contest focused on what each of us bring to Singaporeans and what each of us bring for our future. It is our future that we are concerned about. And friends, it will be a different future. It will be a more difficult and challenging future that we face, which is the reason why I have entered this contest, to offer all my experience and capabilities on the ground for a few decades, nationally and internationally, so that I can serve Singaporeans in the role of President with all my heart in the years to come. It is the future. But I want to also thank all the supporters who are here today, those who are here to support me, as well as those who are here to support my fellow candidates, for coming forward. I know you're standing in the sun for a while. Thank you very much for coming forward. Let's look forward. Let's look forward to a campaign which is fair and honourable, and a campaign which itself seeks to unite Singaporeans and not divide us. Majulah Singapura!
Mr. Tan Kin Lian, please.
All ready? My name is Tan Kin Lian. I'm standing for election as President of Singapore. I want to give the people of Singapore a chance to vote for a president who is truly independent of the ruling government. If I am elected, I will carry out my duties as set out in the Constitution, diligently, honestly, and to the best of my ability. These duties are to safeguard the reserves and uphold the integrity of the public service. I ask for your support so that I can do my best for the people. 我是陈金亮，我出来选举新加坡总统。我想让新加坡人民有机会投票，选出一位真正独立与执政政府的总统。如果我当选，我将按照宪法规定， 勤勉诚实，尽最大努力，负行职责。这些职责是保护储备金及保护公共服务的诚信。希望大家给我支持，让我能够为人民尽一份力。Nama saya Tan Kin Lian. Saya bertanding untuk pemilihan sebagai Presiden Singapura. Saya mau memberi peluang kepada rakyat Singapura untuk mengundi Presiden yang benar-benar bebas daripada kerajaan yang merintah. Terima kasih. Majulah Singapura.
And we just heard the speeches from the three confirmed candidates in Singapore's presidential race. First off, we heard from Mr. Ng Kok Song. He says he wants to protect Singapore's three treasures. These are, he says, Singapore's reserves, to uphold the integrity of the public service appointments, and of course maintain social stability. And he also emphasized that he has no political party affiliation.
And then we followed by Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, and he opened in he greeted supporters, and he also thanked his other two candidates. And he said that he is looking forward to a fair and dignified contest, and he also mentioned that it is a difficult and challenging future that we face, and he wants to offer his experience and capabilities to serve Singaporeans with all his heart.
And Mr. Tan Kin Lian was the final one to take the stage. He asked his supporters or Singaporeans to vote for him because he says he will be a president that is truly independent of the ruling government. And now let's go live to Geraldine Yap. She's outside the main building where the supporters have just listened to the speeches from the nominated candidates. Jerry, tell us, what's the reaction from the crowd?
Well, of course, as we know that the supporters of Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, they showed up in force today. There are hundreds of them, and they were, of course, the loudest during Mr. Tharman's speech, cheering him, and also after the speech, chanting his name as well. And even just right before, right before this, they were chanting his name as well as they were making their way out of the field. But of course, the supporters of Mr. Ng Kok Song and Mr. Tan Kin Lian, they were, fewer in numbers, but also they made sure to make themselves heard. Mr. Ng's supporters came with whistles and plastic clappers, and they were cheering and supporting him throughout his speech as well. And as for the supporters of Mr. Tan Kin Lian, they were also cheering his name, chanting his name, and really ensuring that, even if they may not be as numerous as Mr. Tharman's supporters, they made sure, very sure that they were well heard by the candidates themselves. So I think, the supporters of each of the candidates, they're very excited about the campaigning that's about to come up next. And so, yeah, we'll see how this election pans out.
All right, thank you very much, Jerry, for that update. Geraldine Yap, outside the nomination centre.
Nomination proceedings might be over, but the presidential race has just begun. And here's what to expect from now till polling day, and that's on the 1st of September. With the candidates confirmed, campaigning is now on. Each hopeful will get 2 blocks of 10 minutes of airtime across MediaCorp TV channels on the 24th and 30th of August. Rallies are not encouraged and there'll be no designated rally sites. Posters and banners may be hung along public roads but must abide by conditions of the returning officer. All election campaigning must stop the day before polling day. Now, this 24-hour cooling-off window is to give voters time to reflect on issues and make a wise and rational decision when casting their ballot. And of course, now D-Day itself on the 1st of September. Some 2.7 million Singaporeans, they're eligible to cast their votes, and more than 1,200 polling stations will be set up to reduce waiting time for voters. And this year, portable booths for nursing home residents and optional postal voting for overseas Singaporeans will be available. So, there we have it, confirmed three-cornered fight for Singapore's presidential election.
Singaporeans will head to the polls on the 1st of September to vote for who they want as the next head of state. And these will be the names on the ballot paper: former GIC Chief Investment Officer, Mr. Ng Kok Song, former NTUC Income Chief, Mr. Tan Kin Lian,
and former Senior Minister Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam.
And this has been CNA's Nomination Day special for Singapore's presidential election. Thank you very much for watching. And to our guest as well, Associate Professor Eugene Tan from the Singapore Management University.
Thank you.
Well, you can catch Singapore tonight on this channel at 10 p.m. for a roundup of the day's developments. And there'll be plenty of action and analysis, especially with campaigning beginning in earnest.
And of course, we'll have all the updates over the next 10 days, keeping you up to speed on the candidates' plans as they look to win hearts and minds. Our digital and radio platforms will have all of that as well. So we will leave you now with a look back at all the morning's action. Goodbye.
Mr. Ng Kok Song, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, and Mr. Tan Kin Lian.
Ng Kok Song, saya berharap anda undilah saya.
And a campaign which itself seeks to unite Singaporeans and not divide us. Majulah Singapura!
My name is Tan Kin Lian. I'm standing for election as President of Singapore.